this is a basic 101 overview, and we're going to be talking about all of the different touch points that you need to be aware of. We probably aren't going to go in depth significantly because this is a 101 presentation. We have a really broad audience. We've got people who are working in the nonprofit area and are highly interested in this topic. We've got lay people, we've got state employees, we've got landowners, all across the state, and actually some folks from other parts of the country that are just interested in knowing what's going on. So I think that that's important to set expectations as to what you're going to see, but just know that at our carbonpipelinesmn.org website, we have a lot of resources, and we've been working on this since October, and we're actively updating things on our website, and we'll have more webinars. I'm pretty confident in the future. We do landowner webinars right now, and we have done presentations for various groups around the state. And so there's going to be lots of opportunities to stay current. So with that being said, we're going to start here. And I guess as I was putting this together, I was thinking about where we are in southwestern Minnesota and why it's so personal to us, because we are located in the Minnesota River Valley. We've been here for 30 years. We work on a lot of issues that touch people in all throughout the state, but particularly in rural communities. And we do a lot of work on the prairie. And tonight we're going to talk about pipelines coming to the prairie and what it means for all of us. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Maggie, and she's going to take you through what carbon capture, utilization, and storage is. And then I'll be back to talk a little bit about pipelines and infrastructure. Go ahead, Maggie.
Great, thanks, Peg. Hi, everyone. As Peg said, my name is Maggie Schubert. I'm campaigns director at CURE. As Peg also said, I'm up in Ely, Minnesota, and my internet is not always so great. So I'm actually, while I'm talking and you're looking at the slideshow, I'm going to turn off my video. So I apologize for that, in the hopes of making this a little bit more, slightly more seamless. But yeah, as Peg said, I'm just going to do a little bit of context setting. We're going to talk about these pipelines and these pipeline projects in Minnesota, but we just wanted to give people a little bit of information as to what the larger context is around carbon capture, utilization, and storage in this sort of emerging industry, sort of to understand where these pipelines are coming from. So just starting off, for those that aren't familiar, what is carbon capture, utilization, and storage? So it is the process through which of sort of collecting carbon that is emitted from high emitting industrial sources. So that could be a power plant or some other sort of industrial facility that is putting out carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions. And so at sort of the smokestack or wherever this is being emitted, there are sort of various means for collecting that in theory, then compressing that, probably having to transport it, which we'll get into a little bit later. And then you either pump it into the ground in a process known as sequestration or storage. And so that's the S in CCUS. Or alternatively, it can be used in some ways. And there's a couple of different, in theory, ways that it can be used in different sort of industrial processes. But more often than not right now, carbon that is captured is used in what's a process known as enhanced oil recovery. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So you see sometimes this referred to as CCS or CCU. We're going to use this overall acronym of CCUS that sort of brings together all of these different processes into one basket. So just that's the acronym we're going to use throughout, but you might in news stories and other places see one of these other acronyms. So next slide, Peg. So just sort of one definition check I wanted to do before we dove into some other things. It's just this sort of distinction is becoming pretty relevant at the moment, just sort of the difference between CCUS, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. And you'll also hear people talk about this thing called carbon dioxide removal. And they're sort of related in some senses, but they are actually distinct processes, and that distinction I think is becoming increasingly important. So carbon dioxide removal refers to a really wide range of processes by which you sort of capture carbon from the atmosphere. And there's like very sort of familiar natural ways of doing that, like planting trees, afforestation or reforestation, soil sequestration, or more mechanical approaches. And people might be increasingly hearing about, one of these direct air capture, and this lower picture here is one of those facilities. There's also CO2 mineralization, and so these are more mechanical chemical approaches. But the big distinction between carbon dioxide removal and CCUS is that carbon dioxide removal is, as I said, about drawing down emissions from the atmosphere. CCUS at best is reducing the emissions that are coming out of emitting facility. And so it's sort of the extent to which we will have CCUS and maybe have to use it will be directly related to how much we continue to have emitting facilities and emitting processes. And it's not a process that is going to do anything about sort of the legacy emissions, or the emissions that we have already put into the atmosphere, that have sort of gotten us to the situation where we already are in the midst of a climate crisis. So people in the industry and proponents of CCUS often like to conflate these two things, but they are different. And so I just wanted to make sure that people understood that distinction. Next slide, please. So CCUS, what does that look like here in the United States as an industry? As it says here, there are currently 12 commercial CCUS facilities in the US. That doesn't include sort of research or demonstration facilities at like research institutions. So there are 12 in operation today, but just in the last year or so, there have been over 40 new projects announced that are in various stages of development. So this is a really sort of fast emerging issue, and it's being applied to all sorts of industry, whether that be coal power. A lot of the new projects that you're seeing today are associated with natural gas processing and facilities. Also fertilizer and ethanol, which is some of what we're looking at here in Minnesota. And so we'll be talking about that. But a lot of this is really being driven. So proponents of CCUS really like to talk about how this is not a new technology. And they're right about that. It's actually not new. It's been around for decades, but it has never really caught on before. And there's reasons for that I'll talk about in the next slide. But why is it all of a sudden becoming this really like exploding sector? And that's because there's a lot of money available for it. A lot of it coming from the federal government in the form of various kinds of tax credits, sort of, grants and loans. There's a lot of proposed legislation out there that would increase even more sorts of sources of federal money for these things. And so I think industry sees that. And private investors are also seeing that. And so there's a lot of private money now flowing into this sector that is now sort of making it a lot more attractive just to bring forth these kinds of projects. So next slide. So as I said, though, this technology has been around for quite a long time, but hasn't caught on. And that's because it largely hasn't worked to date at any sort of scale or reasonable cost. And there's sort of a lot of different studies and evidence that demonstrate this. But really recently, sort of the federal government's own Government Accountability Office did their own report of sort of the amount of about the amount of investment, of federal investment that had already gone into this technology and the kinds of projects that had been supporting. And they found that over 7 years, from 2010 to 2017, the Department of Energy has put in over $1 billion towards CCUS demonstration projects. And only 2 of those are still in operation today, or at the time when this study was completed. And none of those have ever met their capture goals. And I think another thing to note, and I'll expand on this a little bit more, is that all but one of those projects was used, the carbon that was captured was not sequestered. It was used in this process called enhanced oil recovery. And as I said, I'll expand on that a little bit more. But I just wanted to talk about one of those projects that was supported by the federal government that I think is relevant for a couple of reasons. It's the Archer Daniel Midland project in Illinois. And it's relevant because that is an ethanol facility, which is what, as I said, we're looking at here in Minnesota. Is the CCUS that we're seeing is associated with the ethanol industry. And it's also relevant because it is the project that folks like to point to as being a success story. And the reason that that is interesting is it's because it's considered a success story because it is still in operation. And that's pretty much the only reason. As it says here, over $141 million of federal money was put into this project. It went into operation in 2017. You will also often hear sort of the capacity of this project as being 1 million tons of CO2 per year captured and sequestered, but that's its quote unquote capacity. Since 2017, the most recent data, it has only been at best collecting about 500,000 tons per year. So that's half of their goal. And it's now been in operation for a couple of years. And just to put a little bit of that in context, if they were to reach even their stretch goal of 1 million tons per year, that would still only be 0.01% of US emissions as they were in 2020. So we're talking about an infinitesimal amount of carbon that is being captured through this project. And this is one of the success stories. So I think that's another reason why it's interesting to look at it as we're considering what this technology is. So next slide. Yeah, and so the final point I just wanted to make before passing it back to Peg about some of the context is, as I mentioned before, the U in CCUS stands for use. And right now, most carbon that is captured in the United States and globally is used in this process called enhanced oil recovery. And what is enhanced oil recovery? It is the process by which CO2 is pumped down into old depleted oil fields. And it is used then to sort of scrub those oil fields and get the oil residue out of there that would not otherwise be able, that we wouldn't otherwise be able to access. And so you will often hear sort of proponents and also some folks who, you know, say they're environmentalists, sort of say that this is a carbon, a climate solution because the oil that is accessed through this process is less carbon intensive than oil that is accessed through more traditional means. And so therefore it is, you know, it is helping us meet our climate emissions goals and reducing our emissions. But I think maybe for a lot of people that you know, realize that we need to be reducing the amount of oil and gas and fossil fuels that we are burning, sort of realize that this is a questionable proposition because it ignores the way that the fossil fuel industry actually works and the economics of that industry. And so that, you know, the idea that the oil that is accessed through enhanced oil recovery is replacing oil that is accessed through other means is not really the way the industry works. So this is going to be additional oil that would not otherwise be accessed and would not otherwise be burned and would not otherwise be putting out emissions. And so I think it's really important to realize that, because I think if CCUS is really ever going to be any kind of part of the solution to the climate crisis, it's going to have to be decoupled from the fossil fuel industry. And this is the most direct way that that industry and this technology are linked. And so I think it's really important that we understand that an enhanced oil recovery is never going to be part of any sort of climate solution. So yeah, so next slide. So what does that mean in terms, all of this mean in terms of these pipelines? So as I said, this is a really sort of fast emerging sector with a lot of new projects being announced. And I think it's important to note that when CO2 is captured, if it's going to be either sequestered or put into depleted oil fields, that cannot happen just anywhere. The gray parts on this map are the places that are geologically appropriate for either sequestration and storage or enhanced oil recovery. And you'll also note that a lot of the facilities where carbon could theoretically be captured from are not in those gray areas. So they're going to have to be, so that captured CO2 would have to be transported. And that's probably going to be through a pipeline network. And so this is the map that is one of sort of the models that has been put out there by supporters of this technology that shows sort of the extent of the pipeline network that's going to have to be built out to support this industry if it really does reach the scale that the industry would like to see it to reach. And so next slide. And so similarly, this is another map that shows another model that again is just sort of demonstrating the extent of the pipeline infrastructure that we're going to see if this technology goes forward to the extent at the rate that industry would like it to. And so I believe that's my last slide. And so I will pass it back over to Peg.
Great, thank you, Maggie. So as Maggie had mentioned, we're here to talk about the carbon pipeline proposals that are coming to Minnesota and the Midwest. And currently, there are 3 projects that are proposed for Minnesota. One is, the first one you see is the largest. It's Midwest Carbon Express. It is proposed by a company out of Ames, Iowa called Summit Carbon Solutions. It is proposed to be a 2,000-mile, 5-state pipeline that would involve Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Iowa, and Nebraska. And the idea is once it's fully operational, it would sequester 12 million metric tons of CO2 a year. And as Maggie had talked about earlier, when she was pointing out the ADM numbers, the 5-state footprint, according to the 2018 data, told us that the carbon footprint for the 5 states is roughly about 380 million metric tons a year. And so this pipeline would only sequester 12 million metric tons of that. And so if you think about it in that context, it's kind of like a teaspoon of liquid in a 50-gallon pail of water. It is a very small ratio. This particular project is the pilot project for that 50,000 miles of build out on the map that you saw earlier, where they're projecting how much they have to build out to be the climate solution or their perceived climate solution. And this is the pilot project coming right through our backyard here in Minnesota. And it's a $4.5 billion project. So what does that mean for Minnesota with this particular project? It's going to go through 11 counties. It will have 3 lateral branches, and it's approximately right now 200 miles. The second project is by a company out of Texas. Navigator is the company, and it's the Heartland Greenway Express. And it is also an interstate project of less miles, and it encompasses 5 states as well, but this one goes east. I failed to mention that the Midwest Carbon Express is collecting all the carbon in the 5-state footprint, and then it's piping it up to North Dakota to be sequestered. The Heartland Greenway project is going to collect the carbon in its footprint, and it's going to take it to Decatur, Iowa to sequester. And then there's a third project that is being proposed, and we don't really have a lot of details on it, but it is an Archer-Daniel Midland project. And I think the company themselves have decided not to be part of other projects, but to create their own pipeline. And we know for a fact that they have a plant in Marshall, Minnesota, but we don't really know what the footprint of that particular pipeline might be in Minnesota. We're making assumptions that it would for sure probably include the plant in Marshall, but it could have a much greater footprint than that. So this map here is an overlay of the two projects. So the mustard colored lines that you see that go up to the box in North Dakota, that's the Summit project, that's the footprint. And then the green is the Navigator footprint. And then these blue square stars are proposed facilities that they want to capture and add on to the infrastructure. Want to spend most of our time talking about the Midwest Carbon Express through Summit Pipelines, because that's the one that we've been working on the longest. We've been working on this since late October, early November. And I apologize that the map is kind of difficult. This is the map that we could get, and this total mileage was before they added on another county, and that's the blue here. So lateral branches are these red lines. This is the northern lateral branch, and it starts in Fergus Falls, and it covers approximately just under 13 miles through Minnesota, but it catches the main trunk in Aberdeen. And then the largest lateral branch now starts in Atwater, and then it will come to Granite Falls, and then it'll go to Lamberton, and it makes its way all the way down to Iowa, where eventually it gets onto the main trunk in Iowa and goes up. And then there's another third smaller lateral branch, which is this one right here that starts in Martin County. And this one is approximately 12 miles as well, and just anchors down and catches on the a larger portion of the pipeline before it goes to the main trunk here just over the border. Approximately, if you see these yellow stars, they are the ethanol plants, and the entire footprint in the 5 states right now is, I believe, up to 32 ethanol plants and 1 fertilizer plant. And with the addition of the Atwater facility, it added another approximate 50 miles. So we're just a little bit over 200 miles of a pipeline. If you go to Summit's website, they will actually tell you that this is the world's largest CO2 pipeline. And, you know, I think the thing that is probably also scary for us is the fact that we are the guinea pigs. We are the pilot project for this industry's scale build out. And as Maggie had mentioned earlier, the issues that we've had for the last decade is nobody globally has been able to do this effectively to scale. And so there's a lot of skepticism around that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the infrastructure looks like and what we know. So before I talk about the infrastructure, I want to talk about CO2. Maggie alluded earlier that Summit and others in the industry will say that CO2 has been around forever. We breathe it, it's in the air that we breathe, which is true, but we've never had CO2 in this form, because in order to put it in a pipeline, we have to transform it. So how is that done? People are curious to know how that's done. And what happens is when ethanol is produced, it goes through a fermenting process and it off gases. And this process claims that they are going to go into the ethanol vat or the fermenting vats, and they're going to capture the CO2. And in order to get it in a form that we can put it in a pipeline, they have to manipulate it quite a bit. So they have to distill it. They have to pull all the moisture out of the gas. They have to chill it, and then they have to compress it. And when they do that, it transforms from a gas to what they call a supercritical state. It's not really a liquid, but it's not really a gas. It's thicker than a liquid, but it's not really a gel either. And the science tells us it's referred to as being in a supercritical state. And one of the things that you really want to note about this is that 2 things. One is it's super important that they distill it. And in order to distill it, it requires a huge amount of energy, because they have to heat the gas and they have to get all that moisture out, because if they leave any moisture in the gas, when they convert it to put it in the pipeline, that moisture will mix with the CO2 and it will create carbonic acid. And that has a tendency to corrode the infrastructure from the inside out, or in the case of the pipeline, once it's in the ground, they have to coat the pipeline on the inside of the material as well as the outside to make sure that no moisture comes in contact with the CO2, because that's highly corrosive. And that's when we would, experience like a leak or a rupture or a spill. But the key thing I want you to take away from this transforming from a gas to a liquid is that when they do that, it takes as much, if not more energy than to actually make the ethanol. And that's really important information to have when we're trying to figure out carbon footprint and viability for greenhouse gas emissions. So when we talk about putting it in a pipe and we send it across the landscape, across the prairie, another thing that the industry likes to tell us is, pipelines have been around forever, so this is no big deal. But we've never had this kind of a pipeline before. And what we've learned is that natural gas pipelines typically are pressurized around like 200 PSI to about as much maybe as 1400 PSI or pounds per square inch. Well, because this is a supercritical state, in order to move that thicker material, it is actually starts at the pressurized at about 1200 and goes up as high as 2800 PSI. So in Minnesota, Summit has told us that the pipeline diameter is going to be from 4 to 8 inches in the Minnesota footprint. Some of this pipeline in the main trunk goes as much as 24 inches. So if you've got a 4-inch pipe or a 6-inch pipe or an 8-inch pipe, and you've got 28 pounds per square inch or even 1200 pounds per square inch, and you're pushing that through the pipeline, that's a huge amount of force. And so structurally, some things that the pipeline industry and PHMSA is telling us, the regulatory body at the federal level, is when we're running pipelines at that kind of pressure, the segments of pipe need to be shorter because they worry about lateral fracturing and blowouts, because if there's too much pressure and there's not enough reinforcement with welds and riveting in shorter sections, it increases the risk of having infrastructure failure. So that's another thing that we want to pay attention to that's different than a natural gas pipeline, like for example. The other thing is compression stations are needed to move that supercritical material through the pipeline. Typically, those would be at ethanol plants as well as along the line. Summit hasn't been very transparent as to where those will be located and how many of those will be. With natural gas pipelines, we have an idea of what like the industry standard is, but because we've never built a pipeline like this to this scale, we don't know what the needs are going to be. And it also is somewhat dependent on geography and elevation and topography of the land. I talked a little bit about pipeline materials. Remember that they have to have a special coating. They're also a little thicker pipe than a standard pipeline. I talked about the wells. Typically, maybe every 10th weld might be inspected. On a pipeline like this, it's expected that every weld will be inspected, or a higher percentage of them. We're not exactly sure because, as we said earlier, we haven't really done anything to this scale before. What are the risks of CO2 pipelines? So obviously, I think we'll start with humans and we'll just talk about what the risks are to humans. CO2 in its purest form is odorless and colorless, which makes it really dangerous because it could be leaking somewhere and we wouldn't know that it's leaking until something happens. And we have had incidents already with pipelines where they've ruptured, and there's been a huge impact on human health several years after the fact. We had a rupture in Mississippi back in 2020, March of 2020. And there's lessons to be learned from this Satartia incident. One is it was in a very rural place. And so we learned what happens when these types of pipeline infrastructures fail. Because CO2 is heavier than oxygen, it sinks, and it's also an asphyxiant, which means, quite honestly, the easiest way for me to explain it is it's what the animal industry uses to euthanize animals. It is a humane way to put an animal to sleep. And so if humans are exposed to it, typically what happened in Satartia is people just were passing out in the middle of nowhere. They were passing out in their cars. Incidentally, because it's an asphyxiant, combustion engines will not work. And so combustion engines need oxygen. So having EMS respond to an incident is near impossible because they can't even get their vehicles there to respond as first responders. OSHA classifies carbon dioxide as a hazardous chemical. And basically that's just because of its impacts on humans. And when OSHA does their trials to determine the impact on human health, they do that in a real controlled environment. Like they do it over a controlled amount of time in a controlled space with like 4 walls, a ceiling, and a floor. But an exposure like this is outside. And because we don't know how it's going to interact, and it's not predictable because it depends on topography, weather, temperature, landscape, it's really hard to determine if there's a rupture after the supercritical material turns back into a gas. We don't know how long it stays around the incident area because we can't see it. You could have a real humid day and you could have rolling hills or a river valley, and it could stay there. Some are predicting for hours, and we just don't know because we haven't done the testing on it. The other thing I would say is Summit has been telling us this is going to be a pure CO2 because we're using ethanol and it's corn-based and there's not other additives. The industry, as Maggie had pointed out, some of the other industries that use CCUS are like cement factories, steel factories, fertilizer plants, coal plants. They have other minerals and additives and chemicals to make their process that actually would end up in the CO2, but Summit tells us that there's not going to be any of those additives. But we know that those additives, when used, have been known to cause liver and kidney failure. And so I think that that's important to know, is that Summit can't guarantee us that only ethanol is going to be in these, CO2 from ethanol plants are going to be in these pipelines, being as they've already signed a fertilizer plant and now a coal plant. And so they're introducing other human risks by adding other forms of CO2 to the pipeline. Risks to the environment. So we talked a little bit about this. So the pipeline is going to be underground. It's going to be in farm country. A lot of the landscape in rural Minnesota is tiled. It's a way that they do drainage to get water out of their fields. And a lot of heavy equipment is in farm fields, putting in tiling, fixing tiling. Well, this pipeline would be below the tile lines, but it presents risks with the potential of, once it's buried, if there is a problem, if there is a rupture underground, it could seep into wells, it could seep into aquifers. And there's several water crossings where it's going to go. I know for sure underneath the Minnesota River, just south of my house, our farm. And if there's a problem and it gets in the water, again, this is another area where that we just don't have enough science to tell us what kind of impact it's going to have on the ecosystem. It's going to create carbonic acid. And with a moving water, then is it going to move downstream, and how far is it going to go? And does it even dissipate in the water, or does it spoil the water permanently? These are all things that we don't know. So they're things that are on our radar for sure. Another thing that we know is that when it gets into the ground and it interacts with other minerals, like naturally occurring in the ground around our farm is arsenic or sulfur. And when the carbonic acid mixes with that, it creates additional chemical reactions that mobilize the heavy, like could be lead, could be organic materials as well. And it mobilizes that and activates it where it might have been in a dormant state on the landscape. Again, we don't know what the damage to the ecosystem would be. You know, liquid CO2 is what we dry ice is made from, right? And people can get burned from dry ice. And so if there's a rupture and this comes out of a pipe and it goes out across vegetation, hits animals, I mean, that it does like burn it. And so it leaves residue, a white powder residue on the landscape. We do know that from simulations that we've seen. And so there's a lot of unknowns. When we talk about risks to communities, rural communities in general, you know, you think about how many miles a county covers and where EMS is located in a county and what response times are. And when you've got volunteer EMS workers who are driving to an incident in their own vehicle and responding, again, they can't really get there if there's an incident in a combustion engine vehicle. And then once they're there, they're going to have the special equipment they need to breathe and to keep their skin from not having contact with this odorless and colorless element that's in the air. It tends to, CO2 tends to sink and follow the landscape and just kind of hang out and seek for the lowest point. And if you can't see it and you're standing in it and you don't know you are, the kinds of human health impacts we have are like, it increases heart rate, it makes respirations more labored and more difficult to the point where someone would pass out. And we saw that certainly with the Satartia incident. And there's been some long-term damage to respiratory systems of vulnerable people that had conditions, elderly, children, people with asthma and respiratory challenges prior to the incident. They still haven't recovered from their exposure to this incident. I also want to just say in Minnesota, this particular middle lateral branch goes right through the upper and the lower Sioux communities in the Minnesota River Valley. And certainly the pipeline goes in ceded territories throughout the state. And there's cultural implications to how the project will impact treaty rights and those communities as well. And then, as Maggie had shown you in the map that we got, what we're seeing from Summit right now is the pilot. And so there's probably lots of other industries in Minnesota, whether it's sugar beet factories or other ethanol plants that might not currently be on the route, or sugar plants, coal, energy generating plants, natural gas plants, mining that can add on to this at some point down the road once the infrastructure is built. So one thing we do know is that this project can't come to Minnesota without the cooperation of landowners. And we know in Minnesota that we don't have eminent domain for private for-profit projects such as this. And so Summit, as well as the other two pipeline companies, are charged with the fact that they have to get voluntary easements. And so something just to keep in mind, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail around easements because we have separate sessions for landowners that can learn more about this, but the couple things that we just want you to know is that easements, voluntary easements, are in perpetuity. So if they sign a voluntary easement now and Summit doesn't, they're not able to build the project, they still retain the rights to the easement unless other arrangements are made. And once they sign over their rights, it's in perpetuity. They never get that easement back. And I think that that's really important. The other thing I would say is Summit is calling this an agricultural project, and they're trying to negotiate easement values based on agricultural land values. But you saw the map with the potential 50,000 miles of build out. This isn't an agricultural project. This is a pipeline project. This is an energy transmission project. And this is a new pipeline corridor. So when landowners are negotiating these easements, they should be really savvy about if they choose to sign an easement, negotiating on pipeline corridor easement values versus agricultural land values. Other things that landowners want to just be clear about, just so that you know, is that when the construction goes through the land, many of the farmers who have worked a long time to build good soil health for their crops, it disrupts the soil health in order to put the pipeline in. A lot of times the subsoil is mixed with the topsoil, and crop production and soil health take, it took decades to build that soil health. It's going to take many, many years to rebuild it. It doesn't happen overnight, and crop yields are not restored overnight. And as we've been told, Summit's offering what they call a 240 split, and they are giving remuneration for crop loss for the first 2 to 3 years. But the damage to the land goes much longer than that. And it's just important to know that. I think that's all I'm going to say on that. I'm going to turn it back over to Maggie.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm just going to speak hopefully fairly briefly about sort of the regulatory and oversight situation around CO2 pipelines. And so I think the first thing to say about that situation, the sort of regulations and who's monitoring these things, to say that that is haphazard would be being pretty generous. We're really looking at a real patchwork of sort of different sort of agencies and entities and laws and things, and that are related to these pipelines, but there are major gaps and unknowns, both at the federal and state level. I am not going to talk much or at all really about the federal level, just for the sake of time. I'm going to talk about what's happening in Minnesota, except to say that this quote here is from the White House Council on Environmental Quality, in sort of their guidance to federal agencies and a broader audience about the regulatory situation, is that there is no federal entity that is responsible for siting interstate CO2 pipelines. And so that sort of responsibility goes to states. And so next slide. So we're going to talk about what that looks like in Minnesota and for these particular projects. So this gets a little bit complicated because there are a lot of different places in laws and regulations where pipelines are referred to. But this statute here is 216G, is the one that gives the Public Utilities Commission pipeline routing authority, and that's more or less the process by which it is decided where a pipeline is going to go. And so, as it says here, in that particular part of the law, it defines a pipeline as a pipe with a nominal diameter of 6 inches or more that is designed to transport hazardous liquids. And so this becomes like a really key point, because in other places and in other states and at the federal level, CO2 pipelines are very clearly considered hazardous liquid pipelines. In Minnesota, while we have this particular, this law that I'm referring to up here is sort of the operational law. The PUC had, about 30 years ago, came up with its own sort of definitions in their rules. And at that time, they weren't really thinking about liquid CO2 because we weren't doing CCUS. And so this wasn't really on their radar. And in sort of their rules and regulations, they don't explicitly refer to liquid CO2. And so the companies would say that means that the PUC does not have routing authority over these pipeline projects that they want to build right now. And we would say that that is incorrect. As I said, the state of Iowa would say that was incorrect. The federal government would say that's incorrect, that these pipelines are hazardous liquid pipelines. But there is a little bit there's some ambiguity around this question right now about who has statewide overview of sort of the permitting and the routing and the placement and the review of these pipeline projects. And we think this is really important because, the companies might tell you, but oh yes, we'll have to get permits from counties and maybe some other state agencies like the PUC or the PCA, the Pollution Control Agency, or the Department of Natural Resources. But not all of those will look at just particular aspects of the pipeline, or one county sort of looking at sort of the conditional use permits in that particular county. But without sort of a PUC process or some other statewide process, we are not going to get a comprehensive overview of these pipelines and of the impacts that they're going to have. And we're also not going to have a process where the public and people who are going to be impacted by these communities really get to weigh in on these projects. And so we think that's really important, just for the sake of transparency and a participatory process, that we have something that looks like this. The next slide. And so that is why last November, we submitted petitions to the Environmental Quality Board saying that environmental review was required for these projects. And again, this is just sort of a basic transparency mechanism by which we can get information about these pipelines from a place that is not the companies themselves who are going to benefit from these projects. And we think that this is required under law, under the Minnesota Environmental Protection Act. Those petitions, the EQB sent them to the PUC. The PUC said, well, we haven't gotten any permit applications from the company, so there's nothing we can really do about these right now. But the EQB did institute a 1-year moratorium on any permit approvals, and that's any permit approvals at any level, whether it be at the county level or another state agency. And so hopefully that will hold until November 2022. And the other result of sort of this process is that the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, the PUC, has realized that they do actually have to figure out what sort of their position and their stance and their authority on these pipelines is, because they recognize that these projects are coming, that they are probably not the only ones, they are just the first, and so we're going to have to figure this out. So they have opened what's known as a rulemaking process to really figure out this question of whether a liquid CO2 is a hazardous liquid. And so they opened that at the end of last year. There's thus far been one sort of comment period, and a lot of different organizations weighed in on that, tribes weighed in on that, other state agencies, and labor unions, and by and large, everyone agreed, except for the companies themselves. Everyone else agreed that the definition of hazardous liquids should include CO2, because there does need to be some more oversight over these pipelines. There was a tribal consultation just a couple of weeks ago. And then upcoming on May 19th, the PUC will be holding an agenda meeting where they will talk about this issue and sort of where they are and what their next steps are going to be. And so as Peg is going to talk about a little bit more, we really encourage people to pay attention to what's happening there, because that's really going to have a big impact on these particular projects and this industry and the sector going forward in Minnesota. And I think that is, again, my last slide. And I'll pass it back to Peg.
Great, thank you, Maggie. So a couple of things we want to share with you briefly. We've alluded to the fact that there's been a lack of transparency from the companies. We hear lots of good things, lots of silver bullets, lots of amazing things about these pipelines, but a lot of our questions and concerns go unanswered. There's a lot of promises made around jobs and around money and building rural economies. And we would just say that you're here, so we know that you're interested and you want to know more and you're concerned. Be good consumers of the information that you hear. If something sounds too good to be true, it might be too good to be true, and you should ask deep questions and probe and find out more information, and don't settle for being redirected. If your questions aren't being answered, you have the ability as citizens to engage. And CURE has been working on this work since October, and we're working with partners across the state and then across the 5 states to keep you informed about what's going on. And ways that you can get informed, we are posting to a Facebook page that we set up that we're trying to put good science and good articles that have been peer reviewed or from sources that we trust on there for your access. We also have, like we mentioned before, on the CURE website under our energy, under our programs, what we do, there is a tab about carbon pipelines, and it takes you to carbonpipelinesmn.org. That's probably going to be where you're going to get the best information. We did a webinar back in the end of January for state agencies. There's a video of that there. We've had speakers present on this pipeline project, and there's video recordings of their presentations as well. We also have media that is broken out into state media as well as national media, international media on these kind of projects, and reports that we're trying to give you as much information to be good consumers as possible. Engage in the regulatory process. Like Maggie said, we had a comment period. We initiated 2 petitions, both for the Navigator pipeline as well as the Summit pipeline. We reach out by signing up for this webinar. We've got your email, and we'll be sending emails out. So like if we have other petitions, or if we need folks to make comments or show up in person or whatever it might be, you have the opportunity to engage that way. We've also been presenting to county commissioners. We've presented in Redwood Falls County, and then we're also doing Yellow Medicine County. But if you'd like us to come to your county commissioner meeting, give us a call, and we'll work with you to try to make that happen. Because what we really know is there's not a lot of information out there. And if you ask your neighbor, or if you ask a family member what they know about carbon pipelines, they probably don't even know anything about them, or very little to speak of. And so helping us get the word out is the best. If you see an opportunity, if you see an article in your local newspaper, or if you want to write a letter to the editor or anything like that, you can reach out to us, and we can help you figure out how to plug in and get engaged. As the slide says, get the word out, help us do that. And I think that's all.